Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started.
We didn't even talk about this.
The email, which I read on it.
Drink your lemon. There are plenty of seats up front. I know that there are still some sessions that are wrapping up, so I imagine that people will be joining us. But in the interest of time and certainly the reception to follow, we thought we'd go ahead and get started. We have saved the no-holds-barred conversation for last. And I am, first of all, I want to thank you for really the deep engagement and conversation that's been happening all day. We started out this day, certainly we started yesterday with the sort of inspirational lecture and conversation that we had with President Earl Lewis from the Mellon Foundation, who instructed us to really think about how we define diversity, how we leverage diversity, and then what more could we do then to engage in this work, and what are the strategies and practices. And I feel like today, I didn't go to all the sessions, but I know from conversations with many of you that there have been some wonderful innovative practices and policies and potential solutions that we all can learn a lot from. And I hope that as we continue to be in conversation with one another, that we will be able to do this collectively, not just individually as institutions, but truly collectively. So I'm honored today to be able to stand here and not introduce my colleagues. These are colleagues that I've known for a number of years. They are the people who on the ground at many of our institutions do often the thankless jobs of really corralling and convening many of our stakeholders around diversity and inclusion. And it happens when there are eruptions on our campuses, when things like, I'm not going to say riots, but there might have been a few of those in the history of some of our institutions. But certainly when there are protests, when there are movements that arise out of a genuine sense of a need to act on behalf of the urgent needs of our constituents at our institutions, these are the individuals that are often called upon to come up with solutions, often at the last minute, often, as they are standing in front of a podium being asked to talk to a national or international public about what diversity and inclusion means in their institution and how they've addressed these issues. So I'm not going to introduce them in the normal ways in which we typically introduce panelists, but instead, I wanted you to, from there, in the spirit of really sharing narratives, and we've heard many narratives today, I wanted them as to talk about how they found themselves in this work and what led them to this work. I know them all, personally and professionally, and so I know how rich that narrative truly is, and I'm actually quite curious to see what they'll reveal or not reveal. But in any case, I hope that what they will be able to sort of exemplify for you is that the job of chief diversity officers at our institutions is a complex one and requires high levels of emotional intelligence, certainly a diplomacy that's second to none. You could all be secretaries of state. And goodness knows we could all use you at this moment in time. But also a real deep understanding of the data and the research around diversity and inclusion, and a sense of what the culture and the landscape and the history of these institutions are like, both now and certainly in the past, but also looking into the future. And so the question for all of you as you introduce yourselves, and then I'll have them after they briefly introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about how they came to be in these CDO roles. I'll ask them then to make some initial remarks, and then I hope that we'll just have a real genuine conversation, discussion around the work of diversity and inclusion in our academic landscape today. So what brought you to CDO work?
Okay, so my name is Robin Chapman, and I I'm currently the Associate Provost and Academic Director for Diversity and Inclusion at Wellesley College, not too far away, and I'm also faculty in the Education Department there. I am an engineer by training, a computer engineer, although my research interest is around developing technologies for learning in community settings, whatever that means, and I like to think of a campus as a community. People often say, wow, you're an engineer and a computer scientist? How did that happen? Like, where does this connect? It comes from really two sources. One is my grandmother, both of my grandmothers actually, who started as, sharecroppers and ended up, finally being able to actually go to high school, after the age of 50 because they had to work on the farm when they were younger, but they were always active and they were always activists. And they always felt that we just have to keep pushing, keep moving. And so I just grew up hearing that. And so, I'm not going to comfortably sit and not at least think about not just what I can do, but how to, kick the can down the road a little bit with other folks. But also, the other thing is I can never resist a challenge. Engineers love figuring out why something's not working, and how can you re-engineer or put a widget or do something, and then when you finally get it kind of going, how do you optimize that behavior? And so it's so much easier to do it with software, and I find it to be a lot more interesting to do it with people and communities. So my brain is functioning the same way and organizing the same way, but it's just more interesting with people. So that's how I got into this work.
It's funny to be sitting next to you, Robin. My name is Lisa Coleman, and I am the Chief Diversity Officer and Special Assistant to the President. That's my title at Harvard University, and I've been in that role since the year 2010, and I'm the inaugural person in that role. And I said it's interesting sitting next to Robin because my mother was a computer scientist, and we all know each other, so we know part of our stories. My mother was a computer scientist, and so I was raised in a home with computers from the time I was 4 years old until, well, my mother's alive, and she still has like 7 computers in her home, and she's like 85, and sometimes she's like doing this on computers. So I was raised with that I was a learner, and that was part of how we were trained to be learners and to enjoy change. It wasn't until I was later in life where I was to learn that actually only 14% of people really like change, and it's the other 86% of people don't like change. And I remember I was in a room in college when someone said this, and I was like, I'm in another minority group. And so it seems like it was natural that I would go into a kind of field that is about change and innovation and the intersection of those things. And so when I was at Tufts University, which was where I was prior to Harvard, I was directing a program, working with students, and I was both on faculty and running an administrative program with students of African descent, and the president asked me to be their first chief diversity officer, and it was from there that I was recruited into this role at Harvard. But I say similar to what Robin has said, it was my background that I think really also drew me to this work. My father died when I was very young, and I was raised by a series of strong women, that's what we'll call them, but I was also raised in a family that is almost all from New York. So my paternal and maternal family, they all live in New York City, except for me. My parents decided to move to Cleveland, Ohio. I'm still bitter. And then when we moved to Cleveland, one of the things that, for those of you who know anything about Cleveland, is Cleveland actually until the 1950s was one of the most segregated cities in the United States. But as a result of that, Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights become two of the most integrated suburbs in the United States. And I grew up in Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights. And during that time, and there's actually a movie called The Battle of Shaker Heights, for those of you who have seen that. And so growing up, I think I was also introduced to a kind of diversity and inclusion, and then the back and forth movement between New York and Cleveland, which also made me really interested in how communities come together, how we work across difference, and this really started for me actually in high school, where I was nominated to do what then was called some multicultural work, and so my high school friends now are like, of course you're a chief diversity officer. So that's my story.
That's great.
It's funny. Sorry, in between tables. I think there are a lot of us here from New York. I also am from New York City. I grew up in the Chelsea projects in Manhattan. I still have a lot of family there. And my parents came from Puerto Rico, working class folks after the rapid industrialization of the island. And I grew up around a lot of family, very conscious of being connected to my community, okay? But I grew up in a very diverse housing project. They were working class Irish folks that had been there for several generations, many who worked as longshoremen in the factories nearby. One of those factories was converted into a very expensive international high school that you may have seen in the HBO film Class Divide. That's where I live. I live in the Chelsea projects, where across the street, students go to school K through 12 for $40,000 a year. That used to be a printing factory. I went to Catholic schools, the parochial school across the street, and all-boys school in Harlem in the 80s. And anytime I talk about growing up, the 80s in New York were a very intense time for a variety of reasons, and race relations and deep inequality. You know, the Central Park 5. I was around high school age during that time. So that was certainly an influence. What was going on in the city? Why were there these deep divides? And I was a commuter student at Iona College, and I studied sociology, and I stayed with it. And in grad school, I never finished my PhD because it wasn't praxis-oriented enough. I went from being a commuter student to getting a graduate degree, a master's degree at Arizona State, and then going to the University of Pennsylvania and studying with some prominent sociologists. I was fully funded. I have no complaints about that. But I would go home from a dinner with a faculty member from the faculty club, and then go home and talk to a friend who was approached by a pregnant woman looking to buy crack. Yeah. So these kind of juxtapositions, thank you, were very disruptive and very confusing, and ultimately I felt like I wanted to be back home. I ended up landing at New York University, where I found a job serving students of color. Before that, I was working with the Police Athletic League, working in communities like Washington Heights and Morningside Heights, mainly with kids of color. And if I would have gotten a full-time job there, I wouldn't be here, literally. But I stayed with NYU, I did this work, ended up at Swarthmore College, where I worked as an assistant dean and ran their intercultural center. And for the last 5 years, I've been the inaugural chief diversity officer, associate vice president at Providence College, and which arose not from student protests, but a recognition that when I was hired in 2005, over 92% of the students in the city of Providence, with the name Providence College, were white. 92%. So let that settle in. And so by the time I got there, the student population was maybe 15% students of color, but we're about at 17%. So when we talk about institutional development around diversity, structural and otherwise, we are probably where a lot of schools here were in the 1970s or 80s population-wise. So that's part of our struggle, but I'll leave it. Yeah. But that's how I got to this position. Oh, and my name is Rafael Zapata. I just want to talk about myself.
We're all in it together. Good afternoon. My name is Naomi Thompson, and I am delighted to be here with my peers and with all of you this afternoon. It's fun to talk about this. This is one of the better parts of our jobs, talking about the work that we do and getting to share it with folks like you. My title is long, Associate Vice President of Community, Equity, and Diversity / Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Rhode Island, which is a small, beautiful place full of big thinkers. And so, that's cute. That's what we say. So, how did I come to this position? I have a different route, also influenced heavily by family and by my parents. Both my parents were educators. My mother was a high school guidance counselor by the time I got to high school. My father taught at Berklee College of Music. And both of my parents said, don't become a teacher. Don't go into education. You're going to be broke. So I went to law school, thinking I'm going to be rich, like the folks on LA Law. It didn't happen. Because another part of my family, and I have family in the audience who can attest to this, was a strong influence by my grandfather, who always talked about giving back. And his sister's child is in the audience, and we were always taught to give back. But also, he had sons who brought home wives who were the embodiment of diversity and inclusion. And so when I grew up as a young woman, as a young child, my first cousins, who were like my sisters and brothers, were half Latino, half Asian, half from Thailand, half white, and every aspect of diversity that I deal with today, I started dealing with as a young woman with cousins who had Down syndrome and people who were in the spectrum of LGBTQ from day one. And this was our norm. This was our family. This was our family reunions. And so to grow up and do this work is just a natural outgrowth of who I was as a young woman. But how did I become a chief diversity officer from being an attorney? I was recruited by someone who said, we need somebody to do the compliance work. So I entered in, not as a chief diversity officer, but through the door of an affirmative action, equal opportunity compliance officer. And I was doing the legal work and handling the cases and managing investigations and doing the trainings. And then I grew in that role from a position at Northeastern University to a position at the University of Rhode Island, where they recruited me to be their first permanent chief diversity officer. And that's how I came to be in this role.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joelle Murchison, and I am the Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Connecticut, Connecticut's flagship university. Ours isn't quite as cute, but I think I'd throw that in. And at this point in time, I can say safely that our women's basketball team has moved on to the next round of the Sweet 16. So they bring us a lot of pride, and I actually have been very fortunate to work with those talented young women and their coaches in talking about diversity, and I hopefully get a chance to share some of that. So how I got here, that story actually starts a little bit close to this place where we're sitting now. I'm a very proud graduate of Brown University, class of '95. And when I came to Brown, it was on the, really sort of on the trajectory of my growing up in suburban Long Island. I was born in Queens and grew up in Long Island. And the experiences of growing up in a relatively working class community that was also very commercial property poor, which for those of you who know anything about education equity, funding is God. And in a community where there is very little commercial property, the tax burden falls to homeowners. And so as an 11-year-old, I learned very early on that people valued the dollars that were in their pocket, particularly if they didn't have children in the schools. And so we did a lot of walking door to door, trying to convince and beg people to pass the school budget so that we would have field trips and new textbooks and things like that. I think that awareness early on, I wasn't necessarily aware of it and how deeply it would impact my career. But when I think back to the thread of preparation for a role that requires you to advocate and bring voice to the voiceless on a regular basis, I think that was my introduction. So from that point and really recognizing that unfortunately it determined the kind of education that you receive based upon where you live, that was my quest to find a way to change that. And I came to Brown with that in mind. I was going to change K-12 education. I was going to be the Secretary of Education. I said that when I graduated graduated from high school. I came here and I double majored in public policy and educational studies. I was off to Capitol Hill after a brief detour because I wanted to go to law school too, because LA Law was the show back then. But Dean Perry Ashley, who some people in the room may know, convinced me that there was no reason for me to go to law school. If I didn't want to practice law, I should simply get a book and keep $100,000 in my pocket. So that's what I did. I went off to grad school at Harvard and was planning to jump right out of the master's degree program onto Capitol Hill and change the world until the federal government had a shutdown. And I had job offers, but they could not pay me. And so yes, while this was a wonderful university, I did in fact graduate with some loan debt, and so taking a job without pay was not an option. So that's how I ended up in higher ed 20 years ago, the first time. I accepted a position at Wesleyan University, primarily based upon the student leadership that I experienced here at Brown. I was very, very actively involved in a variety of things on campus, and yet again, something that I didn't realize how all those things kind of woven together are what were preparing me for the work I would do. So I was the director of multicultural programs at Wesleyan. I did that for 2.5 years, and then because I said I was interested in foundations and they were starting a capital campaign, I had the opportunity to serve as the assistant director of corporate and foundation relations. Now this is from a student who in that very building when career services, I don't think it's there anymore, swore I would never work in corporate America. Well, after spending 5 years in nonprofit, I went off to a job offer I couldn't refuse at United Technologies Corporation, running their undergraduate and MBA recruiting program. 2.5 years after that, Travelers decided that it was important that they begin a diversity program and needed a leader, and so I was Travelers Insurance inaugural Chief Diversity Officer. I spent 9 years there working in the very, very homogenous insurance industry and hopefully creating change and a legacy that we left in that organization. And then this past July, I joined the University of Connecticut as their inaugural Chief Diversity Officer. So I don't have necessarily the traditional path from an academic perspective, but I do think that the journey that I've been on has really, really been helpful, particularly today in terms of the world that we face. That's all I got here.
Wonderful, thank you all. Before I turn it back over to all of you to make some initial remarks yet again, I wanted to just say that, we could have easily have spent, half an hour talking about the incredible sort of credentials, but also experiences that all of these remarkable individuals have, and how they are prepared to do the complex work of being chief diversity officers at these institutions. As you might have gleaned from the titles that they have in their positions, they have a unique vantage point, if you will, within their institutions to do diversity and inclusion work in some interesting ways. And I wanted them to talk a little bit about that as they begin to think about the kind of larger work of diversity and inclusion in higher education, about the scope of the position that you have, how it was conceived. Many of these positions are really new positions to our institutions, and how the leaders, the powers that be, have positioned your roles within the institution to address diversity and inclusion. To what extent has it included faculty and students and staff and curricula and other, staff issues, climate issues, et cetera? So, Robin, yep.
Okay, great. And just got to give a shout out to Brooklyn and the Albany projects. That's where I grew up. So. When I lived in Brooklyn. Yeah, the scope of the position that I have at Wellesley College, first of all, it is also an inaugural position. It came about through a combination of student protest and faculty activism. So a cadre of faculty were very, very interested in having someone focus on this work at the college level. They sort of felt like things were happening piecemeal, if they were ever happening at all. And so in my position, the way it's organized, I report to the provost, and there's a reason for that, given the culture of Wellesley, the very strong faculty culture of Wellesley, with a dotted line to the president. I'm a member of the president's cabinet, and that turns out to be very, very important, because it also means that I work with the trustees on a regular basis. Because I have a faculty appointment, there are certain committees that I am actually, they rewrote it, I'm a permanent member of, or whoever's in my role, the curriculum committee, the agenda committee that sets the agenda for faculty senate, for example, that kind of thing. There's a whole list, I'm going to go on a list of committees, budget advisory committee, et cetera. So it's just really important because the work we do sort of interleaves, and it's just so many pieces, and all the threads have to come together in some reasonable, coherent way. I really have to sort of have a hand across these different areas of the college. Wellesley College has a very strong faculty culture, so they really wanted someone who, even if they didn't take a faculty appointment, could be a faculty. So part of my whole interview process was also going through two different departments, computer science and education, a faculty interview process as well. And it was really so they could satisfy themselves that, wow, you're like, yes, I could be faculty here, yes, whatever. But they needed that, they needed that. In some cultures and some institutions, it's, they don't have to have it, but it's a Wellesley thing, so you wouldn't understand what's happening with that. But what's really, right? But what's really important, and I think this is true for all of our institutions in different ways, is to really understand the origins of our institutions. I don't think with any exceptions here from the institutions we're hearing from, our institutions were not created for inclusive excellence. In fact, they were created for exclusive excellence. They were created to be exclusive. Yes. Wellesley is, they don't call themselves in the same way now, but it was created to educate the bright daughters of wealthy, influential white families of certain economic status, et cetera. And everything else was excluded or not allowed. And so to ask institutions, which are institutions because they, no matter what you do, eventually go back to pumping out the same sort of thing, to ask them to all of a sudden become purveyors of inclusive excellence, it's almost like, schizoid. It's somewhat psychopathic for the, and so thinking of how we do the work here, I realize the work has to be done always with an institutional view in mind, and it can't just be done at the level of students and staff. I mean, obviously there's work there, but you have to work with your trustees, so I do a lot of work with the trustees, raising their competency level and their capacity to think about and act on certain ideas and concepts. The same with faculty, with senior staff, et cetera. So I found that to be one of the really most important things, and it's really using a very strong distributed leadership model. Everyone is responsible and accountable on that campus, including our alumni. And we are expecting people to pull their weight. And sometimes I use words just like that, as direct as that. Other times I dress it up. Yes, other times. But, it's really important for people to realize, even to tell trustees, you are accountable as well. The eyebrows go up, but then once we really start talking about it, they realize, yeah, we actually have some things that we should be doing. It's all the threads coming together to make a cord. I think that's important. So I'll end it at that.
So my role was developed, and I've said this in other instances. So my first role at Tufts, so this is my second inaugural Chief Diversity Officer role. And the first one was definitely out of protest. Students protested, et cetera. This role was more, there was, I think, a moment at Harvard where a group of faculty came together, and they were across schools, and some of the leaders, people like Charles Ogletree, Lonnie Guinier, those kinds of people, came together and met with the then newly appointed president, Drew Faust. And some of you may remember we had a president by the name of Larry Summers, who preceded Drew Faust, which raised the level and question of around diversity and inclusion and excellence and what that was going to look like. So I think after Drew had been president for about a year and a half, this is when this group convenes and meets with her, and they begin this discussion about what a role like this would look like. In the meantime, though, it's important to also note that there was an office that was created as a result of a report, and that was mostly was Drew Faust was the dean of Radcliffe at the time. Evelyn Hammonds, who's in the history of science, who later becomes the first vice provost for diversity and inclusion, and that's when Lisa, of course, worked with us at Harvard. And then Barbara Grossman, who actually later becomes the dean of Radcliffe, but at the time was the chair of computer science and had done a lot with information technology. And anyway, they were the chairs of this report, which basically suggested that we do a number of things, and there were priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3 recommendations for the institution. This is prior to my arrival, 4 or 5 years prior to my arrival. But there was a lot of work really concentrated in the faculty areas at this point, really thinking about faculty. To some degree, some examination of postdocs, but I want to come back because I think that was a sort of, Lisa's laughing because she knows what I'm going to say later. But really to look at the faculty areas. But then I think what happened was this group came together and said, well, look, this is really wonderful, the work we're doing with faculty, but we're not looking at curriculum, we're not looking at pedagogy, we're not looking at leadership, we're not looking at students, we're not looking at staff, we're not looking at the footprint of Harvard, which is actually massive. And I make this joke, my first day I was sitting there and there's a man sitting next to me and he says, I'm just so thrilled that you're our new chief diversity officer, and I'm thinking, you know, wow, I feel like I've seen the pictures of all the deans and I know these people, and he's like, oh no, I'm the head of the forest. And I was like, we have a forest? I was like, this is just too much. Like, this is too much. Like, I'm really, I mean, so, right, because we have museums, we have a forest. I'm on the board of the American Repertory Theater. I mean, it is an amazingly massive institution, and not just, in terms of size, right? We're not as big. I did my master's work at Ohio State, so we're not big in terms of size like that, but the footprint is very large indeed. So that was the first thing that I sort of had to wrap my head around, was what does this mean? We have, depending on any given day, people will argue whether we have 13 or 15 schools, and some of my Harvard folks are here. We won't debate that here right now. But the first thing I had to realize was that I could not have a diversity, inclusion, and belonging and excellence conversation the same with every school. And so and this is where my interdisciplinary background really came into play. And I didn't talk about this before, but I was a triple major in college. I got 3 master's degrees and a PhD. And as a result of that, part of the reason I did those things was I was really interested in cross-disciplinary work and how different disciplines actually operate. And that was just, as I said before, because I'm a learner, I'm very interested in those kinds of things. But what has happened as a result, being in the diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity spaces, is it made me realize that if I'll give you an example. So we have a school of design, and we have a school of public health, and we have a school of education. So I'll just use those 3. Right, so the School of Design is really interested in, obviously, architecture. It's one of the oldest landscape and architectural schools in the country. We produce many people, you know, who are going to go on to become owners of architectural firms, et cetera. And I don't know how much you all know about architecture in the United States, but it is one of those areas that is not very diverse and or inclusive. But when we think about space management and accessibility and what we're doing with building, not just in the United States, but globally, this becomes actually a very important diversity and inclusion conversation, because how will we access our buildings? What will they look like? What does this mean in terms of innovation and climate change and all of those things as we think about millennials? So really that conversation with the design school about diversity, inclusion, and belonging and equity looks very different than when I go over to the ed school, where they really want to talk about K through 20, right? What's happening? What are the educational imperatives? What do we mean by the differentials in educational attainment, right? Health. I love health. I worked for the Association of American Medical Colleges for a few years, and So with the medical school and the School of Public Health, really racial and ethnic disparities in health, gender disparities, LGBTQ plus issues around how are we going to imagine health for the future? And I don't just mean, we can talk later about health care and all those repeals and things like that, but really what is health care going to look like and how are we going to imagine it and how are we training leaders to be in these new areas? So at Harvard, one of the things that, it doesn't matter which school you examine, in their mission statement, there's something about leadership, right? We're going to create leaders. And I say this a lot. If you look at the Supreme Court, we have leaders on the Supreme Court because most of the people on the Supreme Court are from Harvard or Yale. If you look at Wall Street, most of the leaders of many of the major corporations are from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, etc. So when you look at leadership in the United States, there is something to be said for the types of institutions that with whom I work, that we create leaders, and so what kinds of leaders are we going to create and what will that look like? So I think a lot about leadership, and so for my role, it's also to think about senior leadership, right? So my work with the deans across the schools, I report to the president and the executive vice president. When the role was initially established, I don't even remember where they said I would report. I rewrote that. Because what I realized was that at Harvard, the provost role was a role that was only created about 20 years ago, similar to NYU and a couple of other schools like that. So in many ways, even though the faculty work was being done in the provost's office, the on the ground, or if you will, where the rubber meets the road, was at the level of the dean. And right, because of the ways in which Harvard is very siloed, and each school has sort of grown up on its own, right? The business school started at one point, the design school started at another point, so the deans actually have full fiscal responsibility for each one of their schools. And so while the provost's office or the president's office can seed certain things, or influence, or collaborate, or promise, it doesn't necessarily mean that we hold all of the purse strings or, quite frankly, the authority to make those kinds of things happen. So it became clear to me that I needed to be multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary in working with those deans across the schools to actually affect change in terms of faculty hires, leadership, staff diversification, and then working with the students. The last thing I'll say about this is that part of the reason I was also brought in had to do with this area of compliance. And so in the first 2 weeks of my role, I was interviewed by a number of agencies, and I like to think we're friends now. You know, the Department of Justice, the Office of Federal Contracts and Compliance Programs, the Offices of Civil Rights, both in Boston and in DC. I feel like we've developed working relationships and we understand one another, so much so that I fly to DC now and do some work with like Homeland Security or TSA or whoever the group is that I need, you know, bonding. And but I do think that the thing that has happened to universities, and I think this is significant, is diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging roles were created, and we've heard about some of this, that some of these came out of some institutions, compliance roles, et cetera. And we certainly have moved away from that. But I do think that when we think of what's happened with Title IX and some of the other areas around compliance and regulation, these are things that have increased in our institutions, certainly over the last 10 to 15 years. And diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity efforts do need to be attendant to those. I don't necessarily think it has to be part of all of the offices because I think it can take over, but I do think these regulatory issues will continue to increase and continue to impact our institutions. And we think about fundraising and dollars that really becomes with changing demography at our institutions and how are we going to raise funds over time. These all are diversity, inclusion, and belonging and equity issues, and they intersect in multiple levels. And I'll end there.
So again, my title is Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer. I was the first person to assume this role in January of 2012, and that came the result of a Diversity Initiatives Committee that after meeting for 18 months, this was the recommendation. There were no protests. during that time that I'm aware of. Tony, if you have a different story, let me know. But
Of course there
in 2011, and I imagine there were conversations, but there weren't the degree of protest that we had last year, for example. So the institution was being, at least what was portrayed to me, a bit forward-thinking, right? Did they have the same history as other schools? Were they as advanced? Perhaps not. But the school was founded 100 years ago this year to serve new Americans, immigrants, mostly Irish, Italian, Polish, but they also accepted Jewish students, where many schools, especially in the Northeast, did not admit Jewish students or set strict quotas for Jewish students. So that's an aspect of our history that is very important and unique and speaks to the history of this region. My reporting line was initially to the executive vice president and treasurer. I did not sit on cabinet. I still do not sit on cabinet. And that's an important point to remember. I was my own division, a division of myself and my administrative assistant. And when I hired someone new, my director, who's fantastic, but when people assume these roles, especially the inaugural role, people assume that, all right, great, you're gonna handle it. And that's not really how it works. The way the position was envisioned is provide vision. Tell us what we need to do. You'll be the orchestra leader, so to speak, right? But I'm playing a certain tune.
Right.
And that you may not have heard before. And people back up and they say, wait, I think I'm gonna lead this band this way. I kind of like this music. So how do you strategically engage people that say they want to be allies? And I do believe that, but find it very difficult to actually implement what needs to happen, at least from my standpoint vis-a-vis their standpoint. And so that was the challenge. In those first few years, we focused, I would say, on three things. Campus climate, we did an assessment. A lot of times we know what we have to do. Part of the report that had the recommendation to hire me is like, look, we've been doing reports since 1992. They all say we need to get more diverse. How are we gonna do it? Well, let's hire this person to help us integrate our efforts. So that's great, you did that. But we needed so we want to do a campus climate study. It would be too expensive. Let's do some focus groups. So we did that. We brought in Susan Rankin. She told us what many of us knew, but it gave voice to students, faculty, and staff. So there wouldn't be a way of saying, well, how do we know? How do we know? Well, we know, and here it is. But we didn't do a survey. All right, fine. So we kept it moving, and from that developed our Difficult Dialogues Initiative, and from that, our faculty diversity initiative was already on its way. We had some successful years. One year we hired 7 out of 12 faculty of color for tenure track positions. The next year, 1 out of 9. So again, it comes in waves. This year we may get 3 or 4 out of 7, and it's incredibly difficult. And we'll get into how that happens, but essentially you have to be an institutional irritant at times, or remind people, if we're gonna do what we say we're doing, we can't be happy with almost hiring this faculty member. Nobody wants to be the Atlanta Falcons, right? For those who follow football, you could be winning the game for 59 minutes and 30 seconds, and you lose. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear it. And we've had instances where when I hear department chairs or committees say, can we hire both of them? No, we can't. Make a decision. And so those are the kind of challenges that we deal with. So it was the campus climate work, it was the faculty diversity piece, which is ongoing, and as well as the inclusive pedagogy work, working with the Center for Teaching Excellence. After the student protests, which we've done some good things before the student protests. During the student protests, they demanded that this position be at the cabinet level position, be a faculty member, which I'm not. So I was kind of like, all right, let's see what happens. And we saw what happened, so they kind of split it. And I started to report to the president, dotted line to the provost. Very important. I meet with the provost every week and his associate vice presidents. So I'm part of that group. That has been very influential and important for just understanding what's happening and by whom. But I still am not on cabinet. That was a decision that was made. So that's where my position is now. And as Tony knows, we move onward with hope, with optimism, but realistically. And I know that the position will continue to evolve as students continue to push, as faculty, faculty continue to push, it's extremely important, as well as staff and alumni, but it will continue to evolve.
Thank you. Naomi.
At the University of Rhode Island, the Chief Diversity Officer's position was conceived and advocated for by a grassroots organization that included both faculty and staff and had room for students. We didn't necessarily have a protest, but we had folks who were advocating over a period of time for the structure, not just for a chief diversity officer, but they were a group of individuals who were very intentional about creating an office of community, equity, and diversity. And the scope of that is pretty deep and pretty complex. My role reports directly to the president of the university, and I consider myself fortunate in that I truly have his ear, have his attention, and the ability to influence some, not all, but some of the decisions that he makes, many of them, on a regular basis. The scope also includes having a very active seat at the senior leadership table. So I joined the University of Rhode Island in August of 2012, probably 3 years after the President Dooley was appointed to that position. And I was the first hire into the cabinet of President Dooley. So I felt like he had an invested stake in my success at that particular role. When I was hired onto the cabinet was predominantly white men over the age of 50, and myself, and then a chief of staff, and maybe one other woman. Currently, he has had the opportunity to hire a number of other individuals such that women outnumber men at the senior leadership team. And people of color, up until just recently, were about a third of the senior leadership team. And I do think it's the impact of having a chief diversity officer at that table. But the breadth and depth of the chief diversity officer's position, from the way it was created for the University of Rhode Island, includes supervision over 3 cultural centers, so the Women's Center, the Gender and Sexuality Center, the Multicultural Student Services Center, also is in the umbrella of my responsibility. In addition, the Office of Affirmative Action, Equal Opportunity, and Diversity reports to the Chief Diversity Officer's position. And then within the Office of Community, Equity, and Diversity, we are fortunate to have 2 additional professionals, PhD holders, who have the role of Director of Diverse Faculty and Staff Recruitment and Retention. And this is a person who is critical, so to moving that needle, I mean, I think we're in, until January 21st, we were in a very sweet spot with respect to, diversity and inclusion. I see some folks got that joke there. And in that, when I was able to hire the Director of Diverse Faculty and Staff Recruitment and Retention, the provost had also proposed an initiative to hire 100 additional new faculty into the institution, in addition to replacing the existing faculty who were retiring and cycling out. So we had this big chunk of faculty members who the institution was charged with hiring over the next 4 years, 100 new faculty members or 55 new faculty members over the next 4 years. And then in comes my Director of Diverse Faculty and Staff Recruitment and Retention, who has been able to help influence the processes to hire 34 new faculty of color in less than 18 months. Wow. It is amazing. It is amazing. But that's the support of the president. It's a mandate by the provost, who will put in writing to the deans and the chairs of the search committee that diversity and inclusion hiring is a priority for the University of Rhode Island, and you will be charged with working with the Director of Diverse Faculty and Staff Recruitment and Retention, and we have an obligation to move the needle, and then making good on that and holding folks accountable. I was also fortunate enough to hire a Director of Community and Organizational Development. And because the university it charged the Office of Community, Equity, and Diversity with really being responsible not just for the marginalized and minoritized communities, but for educating and including the entire community in that process. So yeah, my responsibility is 20,000 people, and then I have, 20 reports and 40 students, but then there are approximately 50 different organizations, committees, and councils, and groups, and student organizations that focus on working on issues of diversity and inclusion. So I'm charged also with working with the President's Commissioner on the Status of Women, on LGBTQ, on people with disabilities, on folks with veterans who identify as veterans, on people of color. And then within each of the colleges, we have a diversity committee who is charged with thinking about how do we educate, how do we infuse diversity into the curriculum, how do we diversify our faculty, how do we hold folks accountable. So there are many different entities within the university. I think one of my colleagues said before, it's not just one person's responsibility to diversify the university. It's all of our responsibilities, but it's the Office of Community, Equity, and Diversity's responsibility to lead, to be a thought leader, to help direct that process, because I don't have the ability to hire 100 faculty all myself. No, that's up to the subject matter experts, but we can help you define the talent that is there to do that. So I'm going to end there.
So at UConn, I'm probably the newest person here on the panel, and having just established this role this past July, there are a number of things that from each of my colleagues on the panel that the university had done prior to my arrival, as well as what we've done since. I do report directly to the president of the university, and I have a seat on the president's cabinet. Now, I think that came from, to previous points about task force report upon task force report. I mean, you can go online, everything is public for UConn, you will see them back to the 80s. And over again, the task force reports called for a number of recommendations. Well, the most recent, which was completed in 2015, had 6 specific recommendations, one of which was to hire a chief diversity officer, as well as to establish a diversity council at the university. They had done some other things in the past, fits and starts. So to the point that Lisa made about whether on the faculty side or on the administrative side, there previously was an assistant to the provost for diversity without resources. So one of the things that was critical in the establishment of this role was to add resources. So, giving me the ability to establish a unit, to hire staff. I similarly to the structure at the University of Rhode Island, I have 5 student mission-focused cultural centers that report to me. Our African American, Asian American, Puerto Rican, Latin American, our Rainbow Center, and our Women's Center. So those leaders all report to me, as well as I have, because I don't have a faculty background, and that was a concern for them, they did decide, though, to go a whole new direction. They felt that people would expect them to do the same thing, which was to hire or to put another faculty person in the role and then not really support it. So I think they felt like, because in our community, Travelers is a very well-respected and very deeply connected business partner to the education community, that because I had come from there, it gave me some legitimacy around doing the work. But one of my colleagues has spent the last 25 years in the provost's office. So he's my foil as it relates to faculty issues. He leads all of our search committee training and things of that nature. But we also lost our provost earlier this fall. So we have an interim provost who has been incredibly supportive, leads the largest college, the College of Arts and Sciences, And even the dean who has taken over arts and sciences while he's in the provost role is also is a woman and is very committed to the work. So we do expect to really begin to see some movement on the faculty side, which, you know, the student side, I think, you know, in this day and age, it's very difficult not to recruit a diverse student body. I mean, you have to be trying really hard not to, because there are just so many students available. On the faculty side, I think lots of folks like to, you know, to accuse our very rural, bucolic location for this. You know, it's like 3%. I mean, this is public, so it's funny having worked in private industry, we never shared anything. So like I forget every once in a while, I'm like, well, our numbers are challenging and we have, and they're like, oh, you can say it. I was like, oh, okay. So yeah, faculty of color is 3%, that's very low. Very, 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 very low. Like I can count. And UConn is not a small place. I mean, when you talk about scope of Harvard, similarly, I mean, we have farms and forests and all kinds of things. Really, like we have a health center, so that adds another element that is quite interesting. UConn and UConn Health haven't always played in the sandbox together, but our president is making a very valiant effort to operate as one UConn, which means that UConn Health is also my responsibility. 5,000 employees, a school of medicine, a school of dental medicine, on top of, you know, so I mean, the scope is tremendous. The challenge around that is prioritization. So, you know, where do we focus our attention and keep everyone engaged? So, you know, one of the ways through the Diversity Council is I'm really actively giving folks work. They were all identified, there's a representative from each school and college and the larger administrative units, et cetera, but they were identified before I came. So it's really a group of people. I think some very well-intended deans were like, oh, you're the person of color here? Yeah, you serve on that. And so I look around the room and I'm like, you guys aren't really who I wanted to be here. But I'm going to put you to work anyway. And that means we're doing sort of an audit. The city of Seattle, and this is very random, but they did in the 90s this audit of all of their departments to determine what impacts their lack of diversity or inclusion had on, different population groups, different demographic groups. So I'm adopting sort of the audit that they use for each of our schools and colleges and larger administrative units so that they can begin to ask themselves those questions. You know, what does your population look like in your staff, in your faculty, your majors, for example? Because this is, you talk to faculty who are like, yeah, we just can't seem to get any students of color to major in environmental science. And I'm like, how many faculty do you have? How many staff do you have? Like, have you ever had any students, or we can't find any faculty? Well, have you begun to build a pipeline of students who are interested in that discipline, who would go on to graduate school, potentially to, pursue a PhD in that area so that at some point you'll have a pool to draw from? So it really starts way further back than most people are willing to take a look at. And likely the outcomes will not be delivered in any of our time within these roles. And so it requires folks to trust a bit, and that's one of the things that I've seen coming in from the private sector into academia, the siloed nature of academia, trying to break your way into different schools and colleges, with legitimacy that's critical within some disciplines versus others. And so, essentially, I joked in my interview that I was not Olivia Pope and that I couldn't fix everything. And, as much black girl magic as I have, we were not going to see this amazing turnover, like in 1 year. And I think, now that we're almost through a full academic year, and certainly, we spent a whole lot of time this year on triage around stuff coming out of a certain person's administration. But at the same time, I think we have at least begun to make some progress around the dialogue. And that's ultimately where we got to start. I'm privileged to be in a blue state because I think as a public university, you know, having come from the National Meeting of Diversity Officers last week, you know, some of my colleagues who are in states that aren't quite so blue don't have the same support from the governor, from the legislature, from our board of trustees that I enjoy. So I think, and then just one other thing, because I want us to be able to talk more, but I am the only woman of color on the president's cabinet. So just to make that point, we do have a woman president, but it's interesting, many of you probably in women's studies know that there's sometimes this little thing called like the queen bee syndrome. So there's a table full of white, over 50 males, and me, and one African American over 50 male, but it's all the suits. So coming from corporate, I'm like, what do people wear at the cabinet meeting? I don't know. And then it's like a sea of black suits, you know, black and dark suits. So I was like, oh, okay. So sometimes I wear purple, sometimes I wear green, sometimes I wear red, just to shake the room up a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of the reality.
So questions and comments. I'm struck by the sort of approach that each of you have taken, really to not to adapt, but I think dismantle in some ways the structures that have existed at your institutions and reimagine it for the work that you want to do. And so I think that level of empowerment and, I mean, that's what CDOs have to do, right? To lead this work in a complex environment, not just at your institutions, but really in the larger society today, you have to see this work as doable. And I think so often these days, I've met with lots of CDOs, and I will say that many of them feel sort of hopeless, in part because they feel like there are no resources, they don't have legitimacy, there's no sense of prioritization around what matters most around diversity and inclusion, and there's no accountability. But I feel like for all of you, you've found a way to be able to address all of those issues. So think about that a little bit, and I want to invite our audience to ask questions, make comments. Yes?
I have a question from the perspective of a faculty member who is invested in these issues but not trained to work on them in particular. And also, you know, faculty, at least at the institutions, I've worked at 3 different places, one big state school, one small liberal arts college, and then for the past 9 years here. There seems to be a kind of a recurrent theme of faculty versus administration. And this feeling that the administration has power, you guys are, you know, you've got all kinds of control over things that we don't have control over, and the faculty, they seem very disempowered. They have this attitude of being believer and at the mercy of higher-ups telling us what to do and how to teach and how to do our curriculum and how to design our syllabi, et cetera, et cetera. This is not my view. This is the kind of an exaggeration of one prevalent perspective that I've witnessed across institutions that I've worked at. I don't think that's an accurate or particularly constructive reflection of what the relationship between faculty and administration ought to be at institutions of higher education. But my question is, what would be the ideal sort of contribution for faculty members to make in having this work succeed? I mean, in terms of our classes, in terms of our service, in terms of our relationships with you, feedback to you. You know, what would be a good way for faculty who are interested to be more productive in this relationship?
So we've approached this in a couple of different ways. In our schools, we have, in most of our schools, people who are responsible for pedagogy in the schools, who work with the faculty. So this is to help them develop their courses, curriculum, not just departmental, but individual faculty members as well. So I have worked with those directors of pedagogy. In fact, when I first arrived at the institution, a few of those directors of pedagogy came to see me because they wanted to create a group to work with faculty to think about how do we think about this in terms of outreach to faculty. Since then, we've developed what people would commonly refer to as a Center for Teaching Excellence, et cetera, and that has been developed over the last 3 to 4 years. The other program that we developed out of my office, and it was a direct response to this idea of the sort of seemingly, I don't know if it's competing interest or distance between leader administrators and faculty, we created this program called Thinking Together, which was to bring faculty experts from within our university and the local university, as meaning MIT, et cetera, people with whom we partner with, and to actually bring experts to work with other faculty and administrators around diversity, inclusion, and belonging and equity. And so what I did was we defined it more broadly than diversity and inclusion officers. So the initial thing that I did was invite anyone who had anything to do with diversity, inclusion, or equity to a meeting. And 200 people showed up, and which was frightening at first. And then I realized that because there were many people, and literally people showed up who were, I remember one man, he was head of the Ukraine organization, and I was like, and so some of the people I didn't know exactly why they were there, but to your point, people wanted to contribute. And so I had to create a way for people to contribute. So I created a Thinking Together program. We created another program where diversity and inclusion officers meet together. And what was surprising to me about that was we had academic affairs officers who started to join that meeting because they work with the faculty across the various schools. So it was really creating the opportunities for people to buy in. And then it has allowed, I won't say now, I work at Harvard. I'm not going to say that there's been a total breakdown between the distance between faculty and administrators, but we're seeing more collaborative efforts because we've provided those opportunities for people to come together to learn, work, and research. And I would say that for faculty, instead of focusing on what some institutions, and I definitely learned this when I was at Tufts, focusing on things like training, and I say this as a former faculty person, anytime I got invited to a training, I never went. I mean, I just didn't go, and I was sort of obnoxious about it. But when I got invited to a research opportunity or an opportunity to collaborate with my colleagues, I showed up and was totally present. And there is something about how we're trained as faculty members through the process, that things like training, there's certain words, I call them trigger words, that don't go well, right? And so we also have to learn the language, to go back to something that Robin said earlier, we have to learn the languages of our institutions, but also the languages of the cultures with whom we're working, right, in those constituency groups.
Yeah, that's important. I'm going to actually just piggyback on what you said. Everyone in a community wants to have a voice, and they want to feel like they have agency or the ability to contribute something to whatever it is the community is grappling with as far as solving that problem, and so, or issue or whatever. And so, the faculty really just want to be able to see some of themselves in whatever it is we're proposing or whatever we're trying to, programs, et cetera. One of the things that we've done at Wellesley, we did something similar like you're Thinking Together, but also we have out of my office an inclusive community grants program that was instituted a few years ago, and it's actually open to anyone in the community. And faculty use it, faculty apply for these seed grants to try out things and do things. And we encourage them to work with either students or with staff, so because when you collaborate across disciplines, et cetera, we might give you more money, a large amount of money, but, we actually have things that are now either been instituted or are now hardline budget items that have come out of the work and the creativity that they've done. And we said, wow, this is working, okay, let's raise some money and endow that thing and, just make it a hardline item. The other thing that's really important as far as faculty is that it's rare, when my first year there, I would sort of post things around. It's rare that I ever directly host anything anymore. As a matter of fact, we have something that will be happening next week that it's a conversation with me, but it's hosted by the head, the humanities chair, the chair of all the humanities departments have their own they have a chair of the group of them, as well as what are called building directors for the different buildings that these departments live in. So, it's their names first, and at the very end, conversation with Robin, but hosted by, or led by, or, exactly. So it's always about shared leadership, shared responsibility, never use the word training. Leadership can be a very sexy word if you wrap it up into something that they like. So it's, leadership, creating the optimal student experience, stuff like that. That was packed. Because everybody wanted to know how to do that. They really care about teaching at Wellesley. You have to find out what faculty want or wish they could do more of. They want to do cross-disciplinary. I make it sound like cross-disciplinary. I mean, you find out what they want and you give it to them, and part of being able to do that well is going to require these skills. And again, I'm an engineer, so I'm very much into, here are some tools, very specific frameworks and tools. Here's how you use it. Here's how you do it. And so people learn, even my tenure and promotions committee knows how to use the ladder of inference and the institutional, not institutional bias, but, well, they know that one too, but the intersectionality map and how to do that analysis. And they use these tools now in their regular process. So it's really important. I mean, people want to do well, but if you don't give them a tool and show them how to use it, how can they build something?
Good
So
point.
I just wanted to add that what you were saying.
Question over there?
No.
I just wanted to add one quick thing, just to take that to the next level. We definitely hear, I hear certainly from faculty, the question, help me to approach X in my classroom. From students, what we hear oftentimes is, faculty member X did not refer to me with the pronoun that I requested, right, for example. So these are some of the challenges, like on a day-to-day level, that we are trying to find ways to support conversations to help faculty. So whether it means, like, for example, we have a faculty gathering at the end of the year this year, which I'm the keynote for. And we're going to talk a little bit about intersectionality and inclusion and how you can create an inclusive classroom, not from the perspective of pedagogy, but in terms of some of the challenges that students are coming to the classroom with that faculty are not necessarily aware of or equipped to be able to handle from their vantage point. We all have to be sort of first line responders these days, given some of the challenges that students are facing, and faculty certainly are not trained, not to use that trigger word, but that's not what their academic orientation is. So how do we come together to have dialogues that help them prepare for that scenario? Sorry.
No, thank you for answering. I'm a PhD student in the School of Public Health here at Brown, and your answer was a good segue about faculty and supporting students and creating the next generation of scholars, because that is what they're doing here at these institutions. It may not be what they've been quote-unquote trained to do, but that is part of their role here. And I'm encouraged to hear that there's an emphasis on increasing faculty of color, but I don't necessarily know that all that translated to support for students of color or understanding of that. It's very heartbreaking to hear things from students of color who, the very people that they see themselves represented in, outright reject them. And so just placing an emphasis on getting faculty of color coming in but not understanding how to work within the students that are within those universities, I think is really important. And I don't know if any of you have had challenges around that. I personally think that it's a little bit about, we haven't been spreading the accountability, so the faculty members of color feel pressure, they don't want to be the person for that issue. And a lot of times they had to go through very tough things, so why shouldn't future generations of students have to just tough enough because you're going to
But you know what, just to make the point that we often forget that, take the title faculty off, administrator off, what have you, we are human beings that come to the places where we sit from all kinds of experiences and backgrounds, many of which have not provided us really broad exposure to lots of different kinds of people. So, I say this at UConn all the time because, driving here from the very diverse city of East Hartford that I live in, I was joking with my mom, like, oh, this is a town, Pomfret. I use this as an example all the time. There are like 3 black kids in the entire school district. And I've heard from our students who come from there the pain that they experience. Yet and still, there are folks who come from inner city Bridgeport or inner city Hartford, juxtaposed with folks who are coming from. So we forget that people are coming from the place that they know, and yet we expect them, and this includes faculty and staff, to put on this title that gives them some accountability, responsibility, but they haven't dealt with at the core their own challenges around diversity and inclusion. And so we can't forget, yes, we have programming for faculty or for administrators and helping them to, to work with these issues within the classroom, but there's some deep personal stuff that folks still need to address. And that's what we've started with some of the work around bias, I think.
If I can jump in, we're still people of color and predominantly white institutions, so
absolutely.
and that goes for faculty. And I think that invisible work that goes on unrewarded becomes, even for those who are invested, can deter them from becoming, achieving tenure, or may be viewed as a distraction by the people who will be evaluating them for tenure, evaluating their teaching. So, they have to make some very difficult choices, sometimes, competing values, like, I want to be successful, but are the demands of students as legitimate and important as they are? I can't mentor every, Latina student, even outside my major, even though they may want it and they appreciate me, because it's just unsustainable. So the question is, where are our allies in the work? How do we take that burden, just as we try to take the burden off the students, not to have to constantly explain to faculty why something is difficult? It's the same thing to try to explain to students, kind of that reality for faculty, and so that we can move together as a community without, grinding people to the ground, because then they leave the university or the college,
or academia,
or they just don't get tenure. And I think that's the other piece is going back to your question, Nancy, ask us, for some context. There may be some background information. You don't have to do it alone, right? Because I'll have colleagues that, when am I going to get a chance to sit on the couch? Meaning, when are you going to support me? And we can be available to do that as well. But I think we try to help students understand that, but we also have to help white faculty understand, how can you challenge and support thoughtfully students of color, with, in productive ways, so that we have more of you in the pathway.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that too, just very quickly, because, students, right, you want to make sure that students can understand the context more, that faculty, but also your institution's leadership needs to understand that. So I have these really direct conversations with the provosts and deans when they're doing hires, when they're going through that process of the negotiation of the contract. And, I say, look, if your expectation that this person's going to come and just be available to mentor all the students of color, then you better put that in their contract. You better put in their contract about how that's going to add to their tenure decision, like influence it in a positive way. And you better let them know that's what you are expecting. It is unethical to hire someone to take care of something, but not tell them what they're being hired, in addition to their regular duties. Oh, yeah, this is this other thing. We forgot to talk to you about that, So, and also, by doing that, also, they are absolving the rest of the faculty. They are responsible. Their job is to get in there and develop these young people and prepare them to go out in the world and do really good things and help improve society. They are not doing their job if they are not. And really having a direct conversation with faculty about that, which we've actually had a few with department chairs, and now we're working with different departments. And yes, it's involved with the T word, training. We don't call it that, of course. It sounds sexy when we say it, but we call it something else. But the fact of the matter is, we are assuming that that this is your responsibility. We don't absolve anyone. Because I remember when I was at MIT, when I graduated from there, and when I came back to work there, I was literally, it was like a tsunami of students and faculty of color that really wanted me, like, I think I'm not kidding, I had like 80 people that wanted me to advise them, to be their advisor. That's impossible.
Exactly.
Nobody can do that. Meanwhile, you have over 1,000 faculty at MIT who are not doing their job if they're not doing that. And it's the same thing at Wellesley, and I talk about it all the time, even in academic council, and we mix it up a little bit, but more and more faculty are actually stepping up and, saying, how can I learn how to do this without worrying that I'm going to do something that'll look like I'm a racist. So we're working with them on that. But I don't want them thinking they need to do their job. Sorry, I got a little carried away.
We need to spread the accountability, and I think that's key to what Robin is saying, is accountability has to be spread across the faculty. And what you find is the burden of representation that happens to students can become the burden of representation that happens to senior administrators and/or faculty of color. And I think the other piece that we forget about our institutions is we all do have institutional culture. So what we focus on and what is valued, some schools are going to value teaching, right? And that is going to be really crucial. Some are going to value research, right? And how are these going to be measured and evaluated in the tenure process? And to Robin's point, then, what does that mean in terms of mentorship and who one mentors, how many people, et cetera? But the other thing I would like to say about faculty is that for most of us, we were not the most popular people as children. I'm just going to say this out front. I'm saying this because I work with a lot of people, and we talk about this a lot, is that a lot of faculty are introverts, right? They weren't your extroverted person who was out there like the most popular president of the popularity club from 4th to 12th grade, right? It's just true. And so that's not who we were, mostly. I'm not saying some of us were. For those of you who were, congratulations to you. But the rest of us, we were kind of mostly, but lovely people. We got our energy differently, right? Our energy came as an introvert from our internal worlds versus the external. And so I think there is something to be said when we're talking about working with, and I do this a lot when I'm working with faculty and senior administrators, to actually acknowledge who we are culturally, right? Many people who are attracted to higher education and who become professors and even administrators, we're not interested in the corporate world because the values and the things that we actually are interested in are research, is learning, are these things, and they are in some ways an introverted process. And so we need to engage that and talk about that in terms of also how do we spread accountability and learning to a group of people who actually sometimes, right, it's not that they're just not good in groups. And talking about that has been really useful with my faculty and senior leaders to really talk about what that means for us culturally and socially as academics in these institutions.
Can I just add one more thought?
Sure.
I think your question is excellent, and it points to the essence of the work that we do. We call it diversity and inclusion work. D&I are the two buckets that we deal with. So the first bucket that you identified is numbers. And I think it's important that we talk about the numbers, but not to the exclusion of inclusion, right? So it's important for students to see role models and examples and pictures on the wall and people who look like them so that they have role models that they can aspire to. Look at my cousin who's here in the audience. I looked at her. She's a doctor, graduated from Brown University. I wanted to be like her because I had an African-American woman who I could look up to and say, yes, I can go to college, I can get a good education, and I can do something with my career. So you need to have the physical bodies that embody the examples of what our children, our students, coming out of the projects who never saw a doctor, never saw a lawyer, never saw a president of a university who looked like them, so never made that connection that I could be this, that, or especially our generation. And so you need the physical examples. That's one bucket. That's diversity. But then we don't talk about diversity without inclusion. And I think the second piece is so important. And no, we don't all get it right every time. Just because you hire a black woman or an Asian man, doesn't mean that they're going to want to embrace every person who looks like them. It just doesn't naturally follow.
Right.
But it's important that you ask the question, that we talk about it, because if you don't give it language, if you don't name it, then people aren't even going to begin to think about it and to have these conversations to say, is it just the responsibility of the person who looks like that student to mentor them? Or is it all of our responsibilities? And how can we go about engaging in that? So it's just as much your responsibility as my responsibility to make that student of color feel welcome, included, valued, and that they can be successful regardless of what their examples look like. So we have to think about both pieces of that. So thank you for asking that really great question.
Thank you. So it's a little bit after 5, and so I know there are other questions, but I want to first thank our panelists for being so candid and upfront. I want to thank you for creating the spaces for dialogue, but also in endeavoring to facilitate the kind of work, we're not going to call it training, but really the kind of work that we all need to do to be able to understand how to talk to one another across the differences that we all have, and how we then create the conditions to ensure that there is full equity to achieve the kind of inclusive excellence that I think we all aspire to. So I want to thank all of you for being here and spending the day and a half with us. I hope that this is not just a one-time only, let's all get together, eat food, and it was a nice thing, but we won't see each other again. I want us to think about notions of collaboration. How do we collaborate even across distance? There are many of us who are working on these issues on the ground. There are those who are still trying to figure out what is my role in this work. And I hope that we can endeavor to really sort of think about how we might continue to be in dialogue with one another. To that end, we will be sending you, if we might, not that you will fill it out if you're going to be hard about it, an online evaluation, but I hope that you will fill it out to the extent that you are interested in, sharing with us your thoughts, your ideas, and also the opportunities for collaboration that we might work on together. This is collective work that we do as institutions. There's a lot of internal work that we need to do, but there's also a lot of collaborations that we can develop and engage in, and many of us are already beginning to do that, and I hope that this has facilitated some of those collaborations. So in the spirit of collaboration, we have libations for those who are, legal. And I might just say, as we end, we also have collaborations with remarkable individuals who use their talents, their artistic talents on the ground to keep us talking and keep us fed. One of the things that we do have, and again, we don't call it training, but we have these professional development sessions on a weekly basis around diversity and inclusion. Our dining services folks co-host these sessions with us, and every week there is a unique cuisine that's been developed by a host of chefs from our dining services that come from Portugal, from Spain, from New Orleans, from Alabama, from the New England, and it's been remarkable to see the creations that they've developed. You'll get a chance actually to appreciate some of the talent of our chefs here at Brown at the reception today, because they'll be featuring some of the more popular dishes that were featured from our professional development sessions this past year. So thank you all again for being here. We look forward to continuing to engage with you. Thank you again to all, not just our panelists here, but to all the speakers today. You have enriched our days.